Hello and welcome to Interesting Lives of Ordinary People. In this podcast conversation, we have free flowing, unscripted chats with my guests. And the idea is for us to get a feel for who they are, what they do, and what their turning points were that led them to the things they do today. I'm really excited about my guest today, who is Sarah Woodfield. But before we introduce Sarah and as you start our conversation, I want to just say to you, if you enjoy this conversation, if you're watching on YouTube, I would be so grateful if you could like and subscribe so you get more of these conversations sent straight to you through your notifications. If you're listening on your podcast platform, then you can either write a review or tell others about it so we can reach a wider audience. Thank you so much. So Sarah, welcome. It's so good to have you here today with me.
Thank you.
Sarah, you describe yourself as someone who wants to help people understand money and make their money work a little bit harder for them. And that sounds like a really worthwhile thing to do because we know that people often have very complicated relationships with money and very often work so much harder for it than they allow money to work for them. So, can you tell us a little bit more about exactly how you do what you do?
I set up my company about a year and a half ago, and I'm essentially a financial planner because having money is one thing, but knowing what to do with it is completely separate. And I find that many people would say to me things like, oh, I want my money to grow, but not really be certain of why. What was the purpose of having more money? And how were they going to use it to enrich their lives? So I think financial planning is a very interesting subject because on the one hand, it's functional, mathematic, you're just doing forecasts. And on the other hand, it's very psychological and emotional because you're trying to get under the skin of your clients to see why they want to do certain things, what their objectives are, and how it's going to pan out in the longer term for them.
And that makes so much sense because I love the fact that A, you call yourself a financial planner and not necessarily a financial advisor, although I know you do that too, and we're going to maybe come to that in a second. But you're so right, because I think for a lot of people, money is numbers, and they have this kind of prejudice against numbers. Oh, I'm not very good with numbers, and so hence I can't be very good with money. And so the emotional side of it is a key thing. So I love that you explore that as well. But let me ask you, when did you say your company's been going for a year and a half, but you've been doing this a lot longer than that, haven't you? When did you actually begin to go down this particular path?
Well, I retrained as a financial advisor in 2006, or started retraining in 2006. Um, I was previously, or in fact, I still am, a chartered accountant as well. And I had been in audit, doing consultancy, various accountancy, management accountancy roles for the most of my working life. But then once I'd had children, I found that it was more difficult for me to pursue that full-time career. I wanted to have a work-life balance, and so I decided to retrain to give myself that opportunity.
So that's when you decided to go into financial advisory services.
It is, and I honestly say it was a great decision. I've super enjoyed it ever since.
And tell us more about what was the motivation to go down that particular path, because it may sound simple because you were a chartered accountant and then you went into finance, another area of finance, but we both know that actually it's quite a rigorous qualification process and you've got to train and you've got to constantly stay in touch with what's going on. So was there anything in your personal experience that made you choose that particular path?
Well, you're right. I did want to build on my prior experience. I didn't want to just jump into something completely new.
Yeah.
I very much liked the word advisor in the title because I felt that it was working with clients on a more personal basis.
Yeah.
And indeed, that has proved to be the case. But also, I felt that it was a very broad area that would benefit not just my clients, but also myself. So, in learning all about it, definitely there have been benefits for my family too.
Yes. And before you sort of learned how to really manage your money better, what was your go-to way of actually making your money work harder for you? Did you have a financial advisor yourself, or were you just doing it all by yourself?
No, I was doing it, or my husband and I were doing it all by ourselves. We really didn't have a broad knowledge of financial products. And so, learning to be an advisor was as I say, a learning curve for us as a family, as well as for me personally and professionally. You're right, it is a long process. Back then, you had to be effectively level 3 qualified, then it went to level 4 qualified, then it went to level 6 qualified. So there was a constant stream of exams, ongoing professional development, ongoing training. And in fact, once I'd finished my exams, I realized that I simply couldn't put up a sign outside the door saying Sarah Woodfield Financial Advisor, because I had no clue practically how to start the advice process. So I joined a small company as an administrator in a maternity cover position, which was essentially learning from the bottom up, and went from there.
I think this is such an important point. And just for our audience to clarify that we are talking about UK financial
We
services.
are, yes.
And each country has their own specific, jurisdiction and rules. So learning the rules of that particular region's financial, code and rules is really important. So to give people an idea, because I think often people don't really appreciate how much work goes into somebody doing the kind of thing you're doing. How many years or months, or you mentioned levels. Give us a sense of what that involved and how long it actually took to get to being able to offer that advice.
Well, I trained through the London Institute of Banking and Finance, and it took, I think, 2 years initially to get my qualifications, plus then you have to be accepted as a registered individual, able to advise individual clients and companies, of course. And then each following stage took between 1 and 2 years more. So the training feels like it's been constant, because then there have been other things that I've added to the basic qualifications. So I've added things like training in later life advice. I've added things like training in pension transfers. And it is a very much an ongoing process, not just technically and legally, but also, of course, when we have changes in the budget or changes in broader economic factors in the environment, then that affects clients, and we need to understand the tax implications of those
Yeah.
as in order to help clients update their positions.
Yes, and it's such a reminder of, I mean, budgets happen every year.
They do,
When you
they
have a
do.
change of government, of course, a lot of, the balls are thrown back in the end. So yeah, the potential overwhelm for someone who's trying to do this themselves is vast, isn't it? Um, and would you say that one of the things that someone like you is doing is to take that information, which obviously in its entirety is, overwhelming, but find the bits that really matter to that person, because you're also finding out about their individual circumstances. So it's not some one size fits all solution. You're tailoring it to what their needs are or their goals are.
Yes, you're quite right. A financial plan is unique because the circumstances of each client or each couple is unique. And putting that into a plan is also very different in depending on their age, depending on their broad circumstances, depending on their objectives. Sometimes clients don't have very clear objectives, and it takes a few meetings before the direction of travel becomes clear. And that's part of the journey that I go on with my clients, to try and help them resolve what they want to do.
So you're much more than what people might perceive as financial advice. And I think this is, maybe there are a lot of people who will simply say to someone, if you've got a certain amount of money, then come to me and then I'll tell you what to do with that money. So their financial advice is very much like, if you've got money to invest, I'll show you how to invest it or maybe manage it on your behalf. Do you believe that what you do, which sort of straddles a little bit with the kind of thing I do, which is much more financial coaching, and I make it very clear that I'm not a financial advisor. I don't have the qualifications that someone like you has, and so I'm not going to be recommending individual products or even giving specific guidance on what to do. But it's my job is more to do some of the things that you do, which is help reduce the inner clutter so they get clear about what it is they want their money to do for them, and then perhaps give them some guidance on what areas to look in. Sorry, that's a very long-winded question. I suppose my question is to
Well, yes, you're right. A financial plan is much richer than a piece of straightforward advice. So if someone comes to me and says, I want an ISA," I do have to put it in the context of their broad financial affairs. But that can still be quite a transactional piece of work.
yeah,
Whereas if someone comes to me and says, I want to retire, I need to know if I've got enough money that's going to last the rest of my life. I need to know that I can help provide for my children. I want to give them money to help them on the property ladder, for example, or to pay off debts or to help them through university. These different things that people choose to spend their money on,
yeah,
as well as, of course, the round the world cruise and doing up the kitchen, which are always things that people when they stop working, they do like to finish projects. They've got time all of a sudden. So
yeah.
the whole discussion becomes much richer. And sometimes I also have to give, in a way, permission for people to do things. I have to sort of, well, not I have to, but I do say to them, do you realize that if you, for example, allowed yourself a bit more money, you'll still be fine. You won't run out of money. You can enjoy life on a bit broader basis,
Yeah.
and find extra money to do more activities that you might like. Because it's not all about travel and doing up the kitchen. There's many more things that people can do in retirement, and they should really think about that as part of the planning.
I so agree. And I think I love the word permission to actually dream, because a lot of people think, oh, it's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen, is it? So I'm just going to, just make do with what I have. And you're so right. Actually, just putting things on paper sometimes, or, it can be digital, obviously, but providing people a peek into what their future could look like if they made a few small changes is incredibly empowering, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. And people who are in their middle age who excuse me, who start saving, even a small amount of money can end up being quite a lot by the time they might need it for a project or an ambition or whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And so again, giving people the facility to visualize the future through financial planning is really, really powerful.
Sounds fantastic. And going back to your initial experience, so you mentioned, you started working for another firm as as an administrator, and you're really working your way up. So tell us a bit about that experience and what did you learn, and at what point did you feel then confident enough to go and set up something on your own, or tell us what your next steps were.
Okay. So yes, initially, the administrative role was great because although it was sometimes tedious, I did get to understand all of the different financial products better. I got to understand the relationships between the products and the providers of those products, and the various information that we need to get for the different parts of the advice process. One of the things that became apparent very quickly was you do not want to be calling people 2 or 3 times to pick up pieces of information you should have asked for the first time.
Yeah.
So always try and be as expansive as you can and get the right information at the start, and that saves a lot of time. Similarly, once I'd finished or that particular role and the lady came back from maternity cover, I went into a para planning role, which was then taking the outcome of the administration and putting it into a planning report for the client. So this is sort of the next stage up, where you're not actually client facing, but you're still giving the advice. So you're looking at what the options are and selecting the best option for the client, and then putting it into a report. And so that was the second stage of my training, my on-the-job training, which is obviously very different from the exams and the professional training. And then from that, I went into being a trainee advisor, which was on a supervised basis,
Yeah.
and then into a full advisory position. So there are several stages to it. And some people go straight in as a trainee advisor, depends on the firm. But that was the journey that I took, and that's, that's what you've asked me about. So
Yeah.
it was interesting and, helpful.
And what was it like when you first went in as a trainee advisor? Because now suddenly you're having to actually face to face, and work with a client and do all the things that you've mentioned that a planner and an advisor does. Can you think back to when you did your first few meetings, what they were like for you?
Um, well, the first few meetings were there was someone else with me, but because of all my prior accountancy experience, when I used to go out on audit to strange companies, meet people that I had to extract information from all the time, sometimes really hostile people actually.
Yeah.
I'd honed my interview skills, if you like. And so going out to meet people under that situation wasn't such a terrifying concept to me. I know that for some people starting out like that, it's going to be quite unnerving. But for me, that part wasn't the concern. The concern was more, am I doing all the right things? Am I ticking all the regulatory boxes? Is the advice appropriate? So those were much more my concerns than the actual going out to the meetings.
And I think you're right. The fact that you've had those interactions with complete strangers was good grounding, wasn't it, for you to
It
do it?
was,
And of
yeah.
course, looking at you, you've got a lovely calming presence. So I think sometimes we forget that actually the potential client is equally nervous, because talking about money is such a deeply personal thing. And if they're going to come and talk to someone who they've never met before, there's equally anxiety on their part about, whether they're going to get things wrong, whether they're going to be judged in some way. So I think having that calming presence is a really important thing. When and what point did you feel confident enough to maybe start working on your own?
Well, between 2006 and 2024, I worked for three separate companies, and I got very different experience at each one. All of it building up to be the advisor that I now am. And I'm very grateful for all of that experience, because it really gave me the confidence eventually. I wasn't looking to do it, but circumstances happened such that I decided I would.
Yeah.
And I find it very, very empowering. I love what I do.
Yes. And it's a reminder of how you can be the best financial advisor, planner out there, but to actually set up your own business is a completely different ball game, isn't it? It's not that easy, especially in an industry that has so much regulation and compliance.
No, indeed not. And in fact, I went with an umbrella company, a network called the Sense Network, because I knew that on my own, I was not, I wasn't, the only thing I was not wholly confident about was having that sort of compliance hat sitting somewhere in my in my field to say, well, you haven't done this or you've forgotten that. And so Sense are great because they will look at high risk cases on a pre-approval basis and make sure that everything is correct. And that gives also my clients confidence that it's not just me, that
Yeah.
I have an organization behind me that's helping me. So even though I've got my own company, I'm still getting help.
No,
Right.
thank you for sharing that. So now I want to get sort of into some examples of, the kinds of people that you have come across over the years. And you talked about, this is something you're passionate about, you love it, it's your mission. And often that mission is driven by our experiences and the stories that we come across. So could you share maybe one or two that really have stayed with you and maybe influenced your journey in some way?
Um, every client has different stories to tell. I had one lady who had been in the crowd on the day that JFK got shot, for example, which was an amazing story.
Wow.
um, and even though someone is elderly, it makes you realize that their life experiences are much broader than you can see from the person sitting in front of you. So therefore, you should never judge someone from their immediate, situation and their immediate age and conditions and all of that, because there is a breadth of experience behind that person. So I think that that's a very good thing to meditate on when you're meeting someone for the first time, because I've had just such a broad spectrum of clients, different ages, different backgrounds. The only thing that depresses me a bit is that all my clients have got a certain amount of wealth. I would love to be able to help more clients with less wealth, but at the moment, the regulatory regime means that it's really difficult to do that. Because if I want to advise someone to set up an ISA, for example, that's a lot of work. I have to find out all about their circumstances. I have to document everything. I have to research the entire market, etc., etc. Whereas they can just go onto an online platform and set one up themselves, an investment ISA,
Yeah.
with very little input. And the experience is very different, but people don't always want to pay for that, and
Yes.
it's expensive, obviously, because there's a lot behind it.
And I agree with you. And that's kind of where the role of people educating themselves, or, coming to someone like me, because I would help them figure that out, and then they can just go and do it themselves. And I think that's why there's room for so many different kinds of services that help people make the most of their money. Um, in terms of, the gender bias, and often people, and this is, I think you and I agree on this, that it's not just women who don't really understand money. Men also sometimes need help. But in your experience, have you noticed any sort of really large differences in the way um, you know, women's relationship with money compared to men's?
Um, I have had some of the very traditional couples as clients where the husband essentially deals with all the money, and the wife doesn't really get involved. In one or two cases, they actually didn't want their wives to know how much money they had, for example, in their pensions.
Mhm.
Um, but occasionally it's the other way around, where it's the woman in the couple that deals with all the money. And then but that's why planning can be quite valuable, because it can bring both people together into that conversation, sometimes for the first time.
Yeah.
And so then they're both looking outwards rather than one person taking all the responsibility. And it
Yes.
means that also both people's objectives and wishes can come together, hopefully. Sometimes
Yes.
that doesn't happen, but hopefully they do have a sort of joint idea of where they're going.
And it's a great way to open up a conversation on money, which often never happens, even amongst couples, because it can be a source of friction and arguments. Because I don't know whether this is your experience, but certainly my experience is that very often, people are together because they have very different, it's like opposites attract sometimes, don't they? So one person is very careful with money, and the other partner might love spending it. So that in itself can cause some friction. And so what I'm hearing is that having this ability to come together and talk about it and think about the future maybe gives both permission to be the way
Yes.
they are with money.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple that I'm helping at the moment where the wife is a much higher risk taker than the husband, which is interesting. Um, and they're coming at it from opposite ends of the spectrum. So yes, putting them together and getting a strategy that works for both of them sometimes is quite challenging, but it's great. Again, it's down to education and understanding why things are important to each of them in the way that they are.
Yes. Now we've talked quite a lot about the financial plan, and the way money can be made to work harder. But we both know that there's several other areas which are not directly necessarily to do with, setting money aside, I'm thinking about things like, inheritance tax planning and wills and lasting power of attorney and that kind of stuff. To what extent do you see that as your role to educate people about that, or is that something that's kind of left more to specialists in that area?
Not at all. All financial advisors will advise people to make a will. It isn't massively expensive for most people, and it just saves an awful lot of hassle when someone passes away. It means that for that person, their money can go to the people who they want it to go to. It's very simple. Without that, sometimes the intestacy rules might mean that money goes elsewhere. Sometimes it might mean that wishes are misinterpreted. Specific things don't get given under specific bequests, like I want to leave my rare model Bugatti to my nephew, for example. All of these things can be put in a will. So we would always, always, always say to people, you should have a will. And
Yeah,
not only should you have a will, but you should update it. It's not one and done. You should
yeah,
look at it every few years and make sure that it's still up to date with your wishes. And the other thing is the power of attorney. Many people think that you shouldn't make your power of attorney until you're old because it's not necessary. But technically speaking, anyone who's walking around with assets should have a power of attorney, because if they go under a bus and they're in a coma for 6 months, then their family can't potentially get at their bank accounts or sort out their insurance or whatever else it might be where a signature is needed. That's happened in a case that I know about, where the person literally couldn't sign a form in order to release the insurance money.
yeah.
So the power of attorney is really important, and we would advise people to do that once they get into their 30s.
And I think this is such an important point because most people would think with wills, especially in the UK, if you're married and you die, then everything just goes to your spouse. So in some ways, people might think, well, I want everything to go to my spouse anyway, so why do I need a will? But your point about, there might be specific things you would like someone else to have, and unless you put that down in a will, the law is not going to know that's what you want. But the power of attorney thing is interesting because there are two different kinds. There's the financials and there's the health, isn't it? And I think this is something that I only became aware of maybe 2 or 3 years ago when I got it done for myself, is
Mhm.
that even if you're married, your spouse will still not be allowed to make decisions for you if you're in a coma unless there's an LPA, similarly
Right.
with bank
Yeah.
accounts. And this, I think, is shocking because, that how is it that some civil servant somewhere is making those decisions for you when someone who knows you so well and, has your best interest is still around? Isn't that why is it like that? What's the basis for that?
Well, of course, that's true, that you would hope that a spouse would always have your best interests at heart, but that's not always the case, I don't think. And like everything else litigious in this world, you don't want to be in the position of making a decision for someone and then having them come back afterwards when they come out of their coma, excuse me, and say, no, you shouldn't have done that. So I think I can see that it's a protective arrangement for a person. So occasionally it might be the case that somebody doesn't want their spouse to make decisions for them, and they could set up an LPA with a third party. It doesn't have to be a husband or relative. It can be anyone that can act as an attorney.
Yeah.
So I think that it does give actually some potential leeway for people who are perhaps stuck in a relationship where they're not comfortable, and also then it gives the people who are, the banks, the hospitals, whoever it might be, it makes sure that gives them the permission to do the right thing for that individual.
Yes. And I just had a question, and this is a strange one because because I have had my LPAs done and I actually can't remember what's in it. So to what extent can you put in there what it is you would like to happen should you be in that position because we're sort of relying on the person who's going to be our LPA to know what we would have liked to have done to us or for us.
Yes.
But how
Well, ideally, you should talk to the person and make sure that they understand.
got
But
it?
also, there is scope within the setup of an LPA that you can, for example, have some decisions made by one of your attorneys or some decisions made by all of your attorneys. So say you had 3 children and they were all going to be your attorney, and there was an issue about the sale of the family home. You could allow each attorney to act separately, for example, in accessing your bank account to pay your everyday expenses. But when it comes to selling the family home, you can say, well, actually, I need all of my attorneys to agree to something so major.
Yes,
And that protects you against any individual attorney doing something that you might think is wrong.
yes. I think this is such a huge topic, Sarah. I know that we've kind of, we've digressed a little bit from the actual financial plan, but I feel that this is an area where people have so little understanding. Maybe most people don't want to think about it because it seems a little bit morbid to think about, being in a health condition where you can't do these things for yourself. But we know that it can happen to anyone at any age. But most of us don't think about that. We spend so much um effort in creating plans for so many other things, but we don't plan for these things that could happen to us and around us. And just putting a little bit of thought into it might just alleviate anxiety, both for
Yes.
ourselves and for the people in our lives. So, yeah, so I think this is a great thing for us to talk about. So let's get back a little bit to what's happening in the financial planning and financial advice world. In the UK in particular, there have been some quite big changes in the way financial advisors operate, in the way they're allowed to be remunerated. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's affected the industry and you in particular?
Yes, well, a lot of that came about in 2004 and then updated again later, that advisors used to take fairly non-transparent fees through commission on products at quite high rates. There are two quite sort of serious, I think, misconceptions among the public about how products are managed. One of them is around pensions, and they have an idea that they're putting money into a pension and somehow the pension company is looking after them, in inverted commas,
Mm,
looking after them. But actually that isn't true. The pension company is simply putting the money into the investment they've been asked to put it into, and it will just roll on unless it's actually checked by somebody, whether that's the pension member or whether that's an advisor. So there is no oversight, there's no qualitative oversight, if you like, from the pension companies, because they do now have to do a lot more at the point when people are taking money out of their pensions. But that journey, that prior journey, they will perhaps tell you if you've got too much money in cash or something like that. But actually, whether you're invested in the right thing or whether that's going to end up in the right place for you when you retire, that's nothing to do with the pension company. That is all down to you. So you really need to, as a financially aware person, be on top of that during your working life.
yes.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that um, there is this also misconception, I think, that advisors are all very expensive. And research has shown that actually people that use an advisor do get value for money, that they
Mm,
end up with more wealth in retirement than if they hadn't used an advisor. That we can help generate more income, more investment growth, but it's also to do with the comfort around, knowing that you're planning in a certain direction, and that's where you're heading and that's where you're going to be getting to. So I
yes.
think, going back to the fees, all of our fees are now completely transparent, that it's not possible any longer to have hidden fees. And that's the same for the providers as well, because if you look at an investment fund, they now have to publish everything, not just the headline rates on the fund, but also what the transaction costs underlying are going to be, if there's any additional costs. And what started out as a fairly sort of benign looking rate, let's say 0.5%, can ratchet up to 1% when you add on all the other costs. So those costs which were previously hidden from the client as well, they're now out in the light of day. So everything is much more transparent than it used to be in terms of making decisions.
And the other thing that I find is really helpful is for people to orient where their risk profile is, because I think earlier you were mentioning how, you know, the wife in that couple was much more risk taking. I think for a lot of people, they don't completely understand the dynamic between risk and return. So can you maybe, just for the, you know, the audience who are listening, can you talk a little bit about that and how they can sort of assess what their own risk profile might be or appetite for risk might be?
Absolutely. We ask clients to complete a risk questionnaire, which is usually 10 to 15 questions that tries to look at what their natural inclination to risk is. So somebody may be a naturally conservative person, and we're not just talking about finance here. You know, they may be cautious in other aspects of their life, or they may be completely the opposite. They might be a big risk taker, and they like to do things which put themselves in danger, for example. There are all sorts of questions which will help establish that sort of baseline. But it's not a investment by numbers. You know, someone doesn't come out as a 5 out of 10 and then you put them in a 5 out of 10 investment. The planning process is much more nuanced than that. And we look at the broad wealth. We look at, as going back to, and I'm sorry to keep going back to it, but we look at their objectives, and then we come to an agreement about what level of wealth, what level of risk, excuse me, we want to use for the particular investments that they're looking at, whether
Yeah.
that's a pension, an ISA, a general investment account, whatever else, the various other products that there are out there. And so if someone's approaching retirement, for example, even though they might come out as a sort of growth investor, we might pull the risk back because we want to be certain of not losing money whilst they're taking income. So there are different things that will do for clients as part of that discussion. And the discussion is the important part.
Yes, yes. And I think that whole timing thing is so important, isn't it? Because you could be young and you're not going to retire for another 40 years. You know, you have so much time. And so even if your risk profile may naturally be low, it's your role to make them understand that actually you're not doing yourself any favor by sticking your pension money into a very, very low risk thing when actually you have the potential for it to grow over the 40 years. Is that the kind of thing you would do? Yeah,
Definitely. So if someone has some cash, for example, that they want to use for a house purchase in 2 years' time, I wouldn't advise them to invest that money normally,
yeah,
because they don't want to be in the position in 2 years where they're ready to buy their house and their £100,000 has shrunk to 80 because we've had a market drop.
yes,
So the objectives will help determine the timescales, but generally when we're looking at investment, we're looking at least 5 years, 5 to 7 years. And this is another discussion that we have with people to try and match the length of investment with the risk. As you say, if someone is young, they can afford to take more risk because they can hopefully grow their assets more. But if something happens in the market, like COVID or the energy crisis, they've got time for the markets to recover before they need to use that money.
yeah. So I want to just ask you about the thing that, you know, your heart really wants to do, which is you mentioned be of service and help people who don't necessarily have enough money to get the services that you currently offer on a, you know, paid for basis. So tell us what your dream is. How would you like to maybe make financial education and financial planning something much more mainstream, and help even people who don't have a lot of money to make it work for them?
Well, you talk about attitudes to money, and in fact, the research shows that attitudes to money are entrenched quite early. You know, you will learn from your parents about money. and many of these attitudes will persist into your adult life. So the first thing then is really getting education into schools, which is sadly lacking, I think, and getting kids to understand that they need to save.
Yeah.
It's deferred gratification, and it's important that they know that at the end of the day, it's a long way off, but once they stop working, they'll only have themselves to fall back on.
Yeah.
And so it's a sort of a lifelong journey, and not just heading off to somewhere for a weekend trip away because you've got a bit of extra cash at the end of the month. It's important to put savings, building up an emergency pot, and protecting yourself at the forefront of people's planning, even when they're young. So
Yes.
these are the bases for building a strong financial future.
And I think it's also just a reminder, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So, you were saying like, if you're a child and maybe you've got a weekend job, no one's saying that you have to save all of it, every time. You could even begin by saving, I don't know, 5, 10% of it. And then when you see it grow, it's the most amazing thing, because you realize the power of compounding, and how small changes can make, for exponential growth over the long term. So I love that idea. I think the other area we both agree is, I know it's not gender specific, but women do in general tend to fall behind when it comes to especially if they've taken time off, if they've sort of stepped away from their career to be full-time parents. Often, they don't have the same kind of pension that maybe their spouse has, or they haven't got their own savings. What sort of things do you feel that women can do to protect themselves? Also, in the event of a divorce, they might suddenly find that they're left with very little, um, and therefore fall into some really hard times as they get older. What kind of things would you recommend women start thinking about?
Well, I do think that women should not, if possible, should continue to save into a pension if they can, because that will be there for them in the future. The thing is, of course, with divorce, assets get shared. So I know that some women will put together a what if pot, but at the end of the day, that would get shared as part of a divorce as well. So um, although it's helpful to have, at the end, I think that you're still looking at joint assets. So the question then really becomes, am I certain I want to marry this person? Because if then you feel the need to have a escape pot, then perhaps that person's not the right person for you to marry. But we don't give matrimonial advice really.
No,
Um,
it's not.
but I think that if someone is going through a divorce, financial planning can help them a lot, because it can help them explore the house or the pension arguments, which often come up. That women have this tendency to wrap their arms around the family home, and needing to stay in the family home, when actually they should be looking at their personal long-term future, and what that means for them in terms of what life will look like at 67
Yeah,
and onwards.
yeah.
So
So it's education again, isn't it?
it
It's
is,
education, and
yeah.
it's becoming aware of what's out there, what's available to them, and what consequences of certain actions or inactions might be for them. I want to bring it back to you, sort of, and your business, and how it's affected you personally. We all have in our minds, an idea of what a fulfilled life looks like, and I think that what we do in our work is such a huge part of it, because obviously we spend quite a lot of our day doing that. Um, what does fulfilled look like for you in terms of your life?
Well, we do a lot still with our children, so having enough money to do the things that I want to as a family is important. And so having the business, having a continual income, obviously there's a direct link there.
Yes.
I think that I like to have both busy times and quiet times. I'm one of those people who sometimes, if I've been constantly doing things with people, I need to sort of go away and curl up with a book and escape into my own head, and be calm for a little bit. Maybe that's why I end up appearing calm externally most of the time, because I do give myself that extra time just for myself.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. I think that's important for everyone, really, that they prioritize themselves from time to time. Um, and so success to me, therefore, is what I would say to my clients. It's sort of financial freedom. It's not having to worry about money and using money as an enabler, a
Yeah.
facilitator to do the things that you want. Um, Not necessarily in a selfish way, because that could be for the greater good, depending on what your aims are. But
Yes.
supporting, most people who've got children would say, I want to support my family, for example. But other people might get pleasure in using their money to um, pursue charitable aims, or help other people in society, or deal with animal concerns, whatever else it might be. It's a very broad spectrum.
Yes. Yes. And I love that, money is an enabler, and, just having enough of it to meet your own needs, and treat yourself every so often, and do all the things that money can buy is just wonderful. um is there any sort of parting advice you want to give our listeners about, so someone who maybe who's been thinking about mm, doing more with their money, but just feel overwhelmed or not enough time? What's the one thing they can begin with today?
Not enough time. I remember my husband coming home once, and he'd been out with some friends, and they'd all been talking about money in their pensions. And he came up with this wonderful quote, which was, if we spent even a fraction of the time worrying about all of this, instead of worrying about work or football or all the other things that they worry about, they would all be a lot richer, is what they said. So even though it's scary for people, or they don't understand it, it's really important to get yourself on a good path. And so, just give it a little bit of time. Just give it a little bit of time. Even if that's something as basic as picking the right energy provider, going on Uswitch, or changing your car insurance. These little things, they all build up to
Yeah.
extra confidence in dealing with your finances. So
Yes.
just give it a bit more time.
Give it time and just be willing to look at what your money is actually doing and where it's
Yes.
going, isn't it? Because for a lot of people, it's like, I don't want to look, just in case there's some lurking there that's going to make me uncomfortable. Totally agree with you. And how can people reach out to you? And maybe if you could maybe just talk about what the process would be to come and maybe have that initial conversation, to see whether you're a right fit. What can you talk
Mhm.
us through that? What happens?
Yes, certainly. I mean, all financial advisors normally offer an initial meeting for free.
Mhm.
For exactly that reason. One advisor may not be the right person for you, compared to another. So it's having that conversation and seeing if there is this fit, if there's this meeting of the minds, and also to find out what the person is looking for from using an advisor.
Yeah.
Do they want to do the planning? Because the planning is really finding threads through complex problems to come out with the right solutions for clients. Some people don't need that level of depth, so some people can step back and take a more transactional approach.
Yeah.
It's horses for courses, and
Yeah.
so having that initial meeting is really important. And then after that, we, as an advisor, I'm always extremely transparent about what I offer, what it would cost, and then the client would agree and sign up to that before moving on to the next stage, which is the fact finding stage, which is usually quite involved.
Yeah. Yes. So the initial phase is a little bit of fact finding, but it's not the in-depth, like,
Exactly.
actual
Yes.
sort of figures and things. And do you have that initial meeting via, online meetings, or do they have to come and meet you in person? How does it work?
But normally I start with a phone call,
Okay.
um, and or potentially as an online meeting, and then after that I will always try and meet people in person because again, it's especially if you're meeting them in their home, it says a lot about them, what kind of people they are, and it helps you form a picture of what they're trying to achieve.
So you would go and visit them in their
I
home.
would, yes.
Okay, that's great. I think that would be a lot of comfort to many people who may not find it easy to come and see you. But that does mean that you prefer to be in your local area, is that right? Or, how far would you be willing to travel to go and see a client?
I have got some clients that are further afield. One of them, we always meet up when they come down to London, which they do a few times a year.
Yeah.
And others, I do go to them. But they're not the norm. You're right. Most of my clients are within the sort of 50 to 100 mile radius of where I'm living.
Yes. So that would mainly be sort of Greater London and maybe just the outskirts of that. That's great. Anything else you want to maybe just, any parting words of wisdom? Maybe one big thing that you've learned through the course of what you do that's changed your life in some meaningful way.
Um, in the course of what I do, I think it doesn't hurt just to have a conversation. I think that's the bottom line. Just speak to someone
Yeah.
if you're not certain about something, and don't be afraid to ask questions. And I know that it's a very big cliche to say there's no such thing as a stupid question, but I think some people are put off from asking advice because they feel their understanding is too low. But
Yes.
that's all part of the process. That's all part of what we are here for, is to help educate people and help them understand what they're doing better so that they can live better and help their family more.
And the peace of mind that comes from knowing you've done that is you know you can't put a value on that, can you? Sarah, it's been such a great conversation. Thank you so much. And what we're going to do is in the show notes, we'll put, details of how people can get in touch with you. Do you have a website or somewhere where people can find out more about what you do?
Of course, yes, it's www.wealthstream.uk.
So Wealth Stream,
Yes,
Wealth
wealth
Stream.
stream, as
Yes.
in your money is a stream flowing
Ah,
through your life.
flowing through life. Love it. Love it. Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been such a joy. And we must continue this conversation. I can see us, bringing some what we call stupid questions and maybe just creating a platform where we can talk about some of those. So looking forward to doing that.
That would be great. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.